again something which, was afforded to us only because we were going online. And this is something we hope that we can do, as we're reopening as well in our museum space. We hope educators can, use our museum collections online, or even visit us and, look and host classes inside the galleries, use the museum objects. You can even request us for images that you'd like to take into your classroom. So it doesn't have to be that you have to come always to a museum for a school excursion to, make this kind of museum learning possible. But through some of the modules and different kinds of digital content that we've created, we hope that you can also take it to your classrooms. And please also feel free to ask us for any other materials that you think can help us. So this is just really, this time traveling through art is just really one example of how some objects and artworks from our collection can feed back into classrooms, can, or for interested, engaged audiences, even outside of traditional learning spaces. But it's just a start. It's just a, teaser almost. And what we're going to do is we're going to show you the different ways in which we try to use this material, which is why we have 6 sessions. Today and tomorrow we're going to show you a particular platform. So Sujan, if you could pull that up, the Kunst Matrix page, please. So what we did was the same content that we had, the same set of artworks that we used for this module, Time Traveling to Art, we tried to make it accessible in different ways to students and educators. The first was through this platform that you can see. It's a virtual, may I request, sorry, just a housekeeping thing. If you could keep your sound on mute if you're not speaking. Yeah. So first was this online module. It's actually a virtual viewing room. Shujan, if we can just enter the exhibition. But you'll be able to see that it's a 3D room where we are able to place our artworks on the walls, almost like as if it's a, game space or a video game space. Again, it doesn't really replicate the feeling of being in a gallery, but it helps students, young people, educators. It becomes a tool that you can use and you can dip into whenever you need this material in your classrooms. So in this room, we selected a series of 35 artworks, which once again told the story of time traveling through art from Plassey to Partition. So in the first 2 sessions, today and tomorrow, we are going to be taking you through the artworks in this room. 2 reasons. One is perhaps it'll, you can think about how, we are telling a certain narrative, or we are communicating a certain perspective through our selection of the artworks. But perhaps the artworks can serve, as inspiration for other lessons, other modules, other responses, other, inspirations for creative practices. So, we want to leave this room and this resource open. So it's just for us to explore the artworks, learn about them, get a glimpse of how we were using it and the story that we were trying to tell through this room, but also hopefully open up possibilities for what you can do with a resource like this room. And perhaps envision your own rooms with other museum collections or even other artworks from our collection. So by the end of these 2 days, hopefully we would have explored the Kunst Matrix platform, this digital virtual room platform really well. We would explore the artworks really well, thought about new ways of incorporating the art and using the art in our classrooms and learning spaces, and also thought about other possible rooms and other rooms that we can create like this, other resources we can create like this online, from other museums and collections that we might have access to in our own areas and communities. So that's where we really are. And therefore, I just, want to thank you again for all being here. I hope you enjoy looking at this platform, looking at the art, and hope it spurs lots of ideas. And just to say, in the next 2 modules, we'll be looking at how we use the same artworks, but we created a series of WhatsApp video modules for students who couldn't access Zoom or who don't have the internet bandwidth to access a virtual room like this. So today's 2 sessions are on virtual viewing rooms and curating these online exhibitions and using them in classrooms. And the sessions after that are about how we can actually use video and activities and WhatsApp as a way of engaging with students in classrooms. Right. So over to you, Shujan, as you take us through time traveling through art, introduce us to the artworks, and reimagine new possibilities for this particular platform.
Thanks so much, Shumona. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks to Seagull and Achi for organizing this whole thing, because it's really, we have been trying to reach as wide an audience as possible, but obviously we have also been, we have had limited reach so far, although some of our online sessions, as Shumona mentioned, were going, we we did have international participation in them as well. But this is a really interesting program to be a part of, and I'm really looking forward to the kinds of exchanges that it can facilitate. So let's jump right into it, because I think we have had a pretty comprehensive introduction to what we are trying to do in this. So this basically, like Shumana said, is a selection of the artworks that we have at Ghare Baire and from Drishyakala. So at Ghare Baire itself, I think we have over 600 pieces, I mean works of art, which include paintings, prints, photographs, um, sculpture, and most recently a couple of embroidered works as well. So it's quite a large collection, and it's not the easiest kind of selection to make, because you inevitably leave out more than, I mean, more than you want to. But that said, the entire collection itself, I mean, that also tells its own story. But so today we will begin with, I mean, sometime in the late 1700s. So the way this is structured is that we look at the battle, I mean, the aftermath of the Battle of Plassey, which takes place in 1757, and the subsequent establishment of colonial rule, of British colonial rule in India. Particularly, I mean, we are looking at the Bengal side of the story. That's what's in focus today, and so that process of colonization involves, I mean, it's not just an economic or a political colonization, but it comes with all of these kinds of new systems of knowledge, new cultural practices, and so on and so forth, as well as a new, I mean, multiple new ways of seeing. So that's something which we constantly find is, I mean, you see these negotiations that are taking place between European artists and their Indian counterparts. And so we start with by looking at a couple of these works. So these are by Francois Balthazar Solvins, who was a Franco-Belgian artist. And I mean, for those who are familiar with the history of Bengal's colonization, you'll know that it wasn't just Calcutta that was a colonial city, but there were other cities along the river Hooghly, such as Chandanagar, such as Chuchura or Chinsura, such um, as Srirampur or Bandel, that were also Danish, Portuguese, Dutch, and French colonies. So it really was, I mean, you could think of it as a kind of microcosm of many, many different parts of Europe, as well as people coming in from other, I mean, different parts of the world. Like there's a significant Chinese population, there's a significant Jewish population, and it becomes quite an interesting and cosmopolitan space in the late 18th, I mean, through the 19th century. So these works, I mean, they are very interesting to us because they are sort of where the exhibition starts, and these are essentially engravings that he made, which were later which he later colored, because they didn't sell very many copies as black and white engravings. But it was his idea of, I mean, he called India this kind of a museum of the world, of different kinds of people, of so many different things. And it was quite an Orientalist kind of perspective on India that he had, but he made this kind of enormous visual encyclopedia from his point of view. I mean, of course, you can see the biases and all of that. I mean, the racial differences in his works. But I mean, for instance, if you just look at these two paintings, you notice that the figures are strikingly similar. So he's not in fact painting different people, but painting stereotypes, painting character types, and so on. So this is what our exhibition really begins with: Balthazar Solvin's sketches of the castes and professions of Hindustan. And from there we move to this kind of three works that we have selected here, because they represent three types of, I mean, three different kinds of spaces within Bengal at the time. So on the right here you have a view of Chinsura, which was the Dutch colony on the other side of the river Hooghly. So when the English came, inexplicably they set up Calcutta on the wrong side of the river, in the sense that that is, I mean, the drainage of Calcutta, for which we are suffering greatly now and will continue to suffer in the next 30, 40 years, um, is completely haywire because the city is built on the wrong side and the drainage is counterintuitively flowing away from the city rather than into the river. So Chinsura or Chuchuro was the Dutch colony. Um, Over here, we have two images, one of what was known as the European town or the white town, and the other which was known as the black town. Now, these are binaries that have been questioned in recent scholarship because people argue. I mean, if you look at this work, you can see that there are a bunch of Indians. I mean, in fact, in this supposedly this painting of White Town, which was supposed to be inhabited by the European residents of Calcutta, you don't see a single European person in this painting. And this is in fact a print of a painting. But the interesting thing about these works is that at this time there is very little to distinguish between the original and the print because the artists themselves are making the print versions. So this was done by someone called James Bailey Fraser, who came to Calcutta in the early 20th century, early 19th century, and painted a number of these beautiful sort of picturesque landscapes, which were primarily trying to I mean, just kind of convey what this colonized land looked like to people back in Europe, because I mean, there was no visual sense of what this new place was supposed to be like. And on this side, we have his. I mean, this is Charles Doily, a contemporary more or less of James Bailey Fraser, and his one of the rarer paintings of what is, I mean, erroneously known as the Black Town, which is to say the parts where mostly Bengali, usually Hindu zamindar families would reside in the city. And you can see that there is a kind of contrast that is set up even in these kinds of representational strategies where, I mean, you can tell from the tones of the painting, from the angle at which it is painted, that there is a certain glorification of this monument that we see to our left. And which brings me to the point about this painting, which is basically this uh, large obelisk that was planted here. And this takes us back to the Battle of Plassey. In fact, what leads to the Battle of Plassey, which is I mean, one of the things that leads to the Battle of Plassey, rather, which is Sirajuddaula, the Nawab of Murshidabad, and who laid siege to Calcutta, who laid siege to Fort William, which was the British fort in the city in 1756. And there is a legend, there is a myth around the infamous black hole, which was supposed to be, which was in fact a dungeon inside the Fort William, where Sirajuddaullah's men are supposed to have entrapped um, several, I mean, something like 140 something British soldiers, women, men, and most of them had perished. And this monument was built by uh, John Zephaniah Holwell, who was one of the survivors, and he kind of, he was for a very brief period the governor of Bengal as well, and he kind of wrote himself into history by asserting the importance of this incident, which later which later rulers of India, later administrators would keep kind of cashing in on to kind of justify colonial rule in not just Bengal, not just in Calcutta, but in across India. That this was the original act of barbarism which warranted the colonization of an entire land, and this would become a very, very powerful narrative. But what's interesting about this painting is that this is probably the last visual
पेंटिंग्स जो है ना
documentation
उसके
of
थ्रू हमें
this
बता रहे
monument that is there, which was demolished in 1821 because as you can see, it's not in the best of shape. It's kind of falling into pieces. There are people who have started using it as we tend to do. I mean, there's this huge monument, no one really knows what it says, it stands for, and it just becomes part of the urban architecture which you can then appropriate and use for your own needs. And this wasn't very convenient because on the left is the writers building, this very long stretch, and right at the end is St. Andrew's Church, which was the Scottish church of St. Andrews in Calcutta. And in 1821, this building is then demolished, but it is again sort of resurrected in 1902 by Lord Curzon, who believes that this myth needs to be kind of revived, and it is the founding myth of the colonial rule in India. And they resurrect this monument even larger in the exact same spot. Um, but yeah, so I mean, now if you come to Calcutta, you won't find it here, because in the 1940s, at the peak of the nationalist movement, Subhash Chandra Bose led a campaign to have it removed. And although he was arrested and that particular campaign was derailed by the British government, they did decide that it was an unnecessary provocation to leave a marker of colonial oppression out in public view. And so they moved it to the insides of a church, St. John's Church, which is also in the neighborhood. So this is essentially the kind of first phase when European artists are coming to Bengal, representing a land and its people with whom Europeans back at home may be unfamiliar. And you can see that there is ethnography on the left hand side, where they are kind of trying to represent what the people look like. There is this new art of landscape painting which is coming in, but there are other modes of painting as well, because it's we all, I mean, perhaps we don't recognize it enough, but often um, how we perceive history is so very colored by the genres of representation that we have. So how do we represent history in a certain, I mean, a certain incident? Is it represented historically? Is it represented through a kind of literary sensationalism? I mean, that becomes a very important way in which we remember as well certain incidents. So, or as in this case, do you build a monument to it and thus try to commemorate that? Um, so the next phase that we'll be looking at is
Srihan, if we can
roughly,
go back
yeah,
to the Horrible
sure,
Monument
absolutely,
image, please.
yeah,
So just to also contextualize it, like whenever we
Şimdi
do this,
bakın.
these Zoom sessions with students, what we usually do is we don't really, right now we're sharing all this information with you, but we try to ask a lot of questions because and it happens in small groups, say with 20 students or 30 students. So right now, because there are so many people on this call, we can't really do a more interactive format. But what we typically do is with this painting, for example, we say that, okay, this is a painting that we look at the contentions around the Battle of Plassey and after, and how that history is remembered after. So we start by, for example, asking that, what do you think this? Do you think that people in this at this time, was this monument a valued monument, or what was the people? What were the people? How do the people of this time, or the people you see on the street, what was their disposition towards this monument? Why do you think that the event was mostly forgotten, or do you think it was something that people thought was still very important? Why was this monument built at in the heart of the city, of the colonial city? Why did the colonizers think the story was important of the black hole tragedy? And how did they use it to sort of how to justify the Battle of Plassey and the colonization of Bengal? So that's how we sort of try and use the painting to take an event or an incident which is quite familiar, something that we read quite a bit, but to really get students to think about the way in which people related to this history, and how that history was very purposely shaped and reshaped over time, especially when you then learn about the fact that it was installed again once it was demolished, and then how Netaji responded to it. So that's how we sort of use the artwork to unpack this moment and this time in history, whether it's the Battle of Plassey itself, its aftermath, or the growth of Calcutta and what the city looked like at that point of time. What was the
Nie, ty
interaction
kelle kura nge ta jam disturb shit.
between the
Ty uçta meri.
colonizers and the colonized? So yeah, so just wanted to jump in there to talk a little bit about how also we've been using the artwork and in this Zoom platform. And of course, like I said, we also used it in WhatsApp modules and video modules and activities, which we'll talk about in the next set of interactions. Yeah, Shujan.
yeah. So thanks for that, Rumana. Yeah, that's definitely something that we try to keep in mind, and just wonder. I mean, because it's so easy to see these as just as I was doing, which is to say that as
Sorry, sorry.
yeah, but when you look a little closer, there are so many of these questions. There's questions of perspective, of which side is writing this history, what is at stake, all of that which comes to the fore. Um, Moving on to the next section, we find this remarkable print, which is titled "The Triumphal Reception of the Sikh Guns." So this was in 1843 or 1844. This is the first Anglo-Sikh war where the, the British won an important battle at Sobrao. So, if anyone would like to kind of hazard a guess as to what is happening, would it? I mean, or what do you see in this painting? Because there's so much that is happening. It's um, quite interesting because I'm sure that different people notice different things in this because there's just so much that is going on. So if anyone would like to kind of unmute and say or if they have anything to share about this work or in the chat box, that's also fine. Yeah, Keshav, thanks for those points. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Keshav is saying that um, this tendency to create myths to portray the indigenous as brute and barbaric in order to justify the exploitation of the civilizing mission. Saloni is saying it's a victory parade. That's basically what it is. It's kind of a victory parade where they and again, this is one of those paintings, which kind of makes you uh, check what you think we know about history. And this is a victory parade in a sense. What happened was that once the British won this battle at Sabrao, they had this enormous, some 250 odd guns that the Sikh army were using, which were the very, the most cutting edge technology in weaponry that the British had seen so far. And so they were so thrilled to have won this battle that they actually brought all those guns from the Punjab to Bengal. And the building that you see behind is the governor's house. So they lined it up in front of the governor's house. They made it into a kind of almost like a civic exhibition where people were invited to come and look at this kind of trophy that they had won in this battle. And what's very interesting also is that over on this left hand corner, you can see that there is this, quite literally social distancing that's happening here, where this mounted soldier is keeping the commoners, sort of, so to speak, away from the rich and famous of Calcutta, of Bengal society. And this particular work, this was created by William Taylor, who again had this habit of constantly kind of visually documenting everything. He later said that I've documented everything right down to the smallest pin that I saw lying around. So he was kind of an obsessive sort of archivist, documenter of everything that he saw. And the reason why I'm getting into this, or the reason why this particular work is there, is that apart from telling this interesting story about the technological advancements that were there among within Indian militaries as well, it's the fact that it kind of helps us talk about this other mode of painting, which is basically the historic or the journalistic historic mode of painting, where um, through art, certain events were given a kind of historical stature. So, the very act of representing it gives it that stature among significant events that are taking place within India, and also it serves a journalistic purpose because that's how most of these images and these bits of news are circulating around the empire. So, the next one again is a very interesting case in point, uh, which is the Darbar of the Maharajah of Mysore. So this was based on a painting done by F.C. Lewis Jr., whose father was an engraver to the Queen. And it is a very, very fine work. You can only go so deep into the details here, but if you happen to visit or if you happen to find a copy of this online, it's absolutely brilliantly done in terms of the sheer detailing of it. This was right after Tipu Sultan was deposed from the throne of Mysore, and a fairly docile replacement was found in his stead. And this is basically, again, like the previous one, a kind of um, legitimization of that rule, and uh, that basically is kind of first painted and then engraved in this kind of beautiful way. And it was, it became so famous at the time that newspapers around the empire were writing about this particular print. And this is where we come to a very interesting juncture, which is basically this point where, um, along with this kind of history, also we find this merging of the history of art, because while 1857 was, while the first war of independence was taking place in northern India, in Bengal, in Calcutta, we saw the first of the government art schools and colleges. So these were not initially government art schools and colleges, but they were schools that were founded privately and later taken over by the government. But you see this kind of coming together of different cultures that's happening. Um, Completely, it's so difficult to kind of reconcile these two occurrences unless you kind of try to see this from a class perspective as well. That, who are the people who are patronizing the arts in Bengal? Who are the people who are fighting the first war of independence? Where is the leadership of that, and so on? And what happens at this stage is that a lot of artists, because following 1757, Murshidabad no longer retains the kind of pomp and glory that it had as the capital of Bengal. And a lot of artists from Murshidabad, as well as from different parts of Bengal, that's greater Bengal that we are talking about at that point, not just West Bengal as we know it, but including Bihar, Orissa, and what is now Bangladesh, and as well as some parts of Assam, I think, who are kind of coming together, and they are sort of exchanging notes with the colonial painters. And what we see over here is a remarkable example of that, where a story from a Hindu mythological text uh, is kind of recast in the same, almost exactly the same kind of architecture, as well as, if you look at the costumes in detail, if you look at the composition, it's recast in that realist historical painting mode. And you tend to wonder whether this is where we start confusing history and mythology and start, um, you know, evaluating them in a confused and inaccurate manner. Um, so what, does anyone want to come, just sort of come in and share your thoughts on this? What, if you think, if you can think of other examples, perhaps in not just in the arts, but in anything else that you can think of, in literature, in theater, history, in whatever, where this kind of change takes place. Um, in the meantime, I'll just go over a few of the comments that you're sending us. Anjana Banerjee is saying group of Maratha chiefs, intimidating spectacle for Indians. Intimidating, yes, but at the same time, there is a kind of celebration of that. I think this was for the previous work, which was um, the triumphal return of the Sikh guns, and there is a kind of celebration. I'm not sure. Again, that's an interesting question to ask. How would these people on the ground be feeling about this? Would you be awed by the presence of this kind of, by the grandeur of it, or would you feel resentment? That's something that, that precisely is the point of a module like this, because through paintings, the moment you insert this kind of subjectivity into these historical moments, you start to get, uncomfortable questions. How we ourselves are viewing historical events in our time. So, how are we responding to that? Are we complicit? All of these things come to the fore the moment you put your subjectivity within these paintings. So thanks for that question. Siloni is saying such colleges were responsible for the infusion of Western art models principles into local arts, weren't they? Like paintings of gods and goddesses. Yes, absolutely. That's definitely an important part of this. what's also interesting is that because of this, a lot of these painters found patronage because the wealthy, sorry, because wealthy zamindari families in Bengal, mostly of Hindu upper caste, would be commissioning these works. And there are some art historians who believe that they would actually be seen as much as religious objects as they would be as artistic objects. So, which also explains why perhaps a lot of these works are anonymous. So, even though we know this is by F.C. Lewis, then engraved. We don't know who these are, who painted these scenes. I mean, this is an oil and canvas work. On the right, again, we have two similar scenes where you see the same kind of, historical mode of painting. And by this European mode, what do we mean? So, what are the different features that we notice that help us identify this as Saloni was saying in the chat box, as a European mode as opposed to the indigenous traditions. So I'll just pause here for a minute. If there are thoughts, if you want to say what are the things that kind of make you identify this as one and not the other? Just love to hear from whoever wants to have a go at it.
Then maybe we can zoom into one of the paintings to
Yeah,
discuss
sure.
that, to really unpack the European influences on local narratives and traditions.
Two participants raised hands. How do I? Yeah. Keshav?
Okay, so can you go back to the last painting, the one with the Draupadi scene?
Absolutely. Yep.
So what I find interesting here is over the pillar you can see a sort of what I am not an architecture student, but I would call this a sort of kalash, and this has caused a lot of confusion in modern pseudo historians who kind of calls kalash architecture as Hindu architecture. So if you can shed some light on this, because this is some sort of mixing here, because there is a pillar over there is a kalash and then there is an arch. So when you listen to a lot of pseudo historians today, they say that look, there was a kalash in this architecture, that the Muslim must have broken down the temples here and built their buildings. So
Mm.
this is something I find interesting here
Yeah.
in the architecture that is displayed in the painting.
Thanks, Keshav. That's a very interesting point. Uh, to be very honest, I'm not a student of architecture or architectural history myself. Um, what I find interesting, which is why I went back to check with the original, with the not the original, but with the earlier work, let's put it that way, is the same thing is present here as well. And this is the court of Mysore. And what's interesting about this work is that, I mean, it is something that today we recognize as Mughal architecture for sure. I mean, there can be very little doubt about that. The pointed arches, this kind of onion shaped arches rather than the Gothic kind of parabolic arches that were there. But what's quite remarkable also is that, that this seemingly um Mughal feature. I mean, I don't know if it was exclusively Mughal. I can't really say if it was or wasn't. That we'll have to trust an architectural historian with that. But what's interesting for me is related to the point that you're making is the fact that this architecture is being used within to represent a Hindu mythological event, which is from the Mahabharata. This is Draupadi's Vastraharan, right? And there, because probably the artist is looking to kind of looking for signs of grandeur, signs of pomp, and so on, they are turning to whatever is the existing kind of symbols that people can identify. And the symbols that people can identify at this point are these kinds of Mughal architecture, or I mean, later on we'll find some examples of colonial, I mean, of European colonial architecture as well. But this Hindu mythology gets recast in this mode, and you can see the costumes and the ornamentation and everything, which, I mean, almost is directly kind of um, is borrowed from this engraving. So that in itself, I think, is a fairly interesting adaptation that is happening at this point. But I mean, we'll definitely try and look up the question that you posed before us. I really don't know about that. And I mean, if there's anyone in the audience who knows more, maybe you can shed light if you have researched on this, or if you work on this in some way. So,
You have another raised hand, no?
yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's unmuted. So if you would like to
Okay.
speak, please go ahead. Okay, so we'll just move to the next one. If you want to speak, just go for it. Um, these again, Shumana, would you like to? Did you have something in mind
Mm.
about the museum? Sorry. Yes.
So Jayati Singh, this is very Deccani, and Deccan was of course known for cosmopolitan architecture. Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you for that, Jayati.
Yeah.
Color choice reminds me of Hieronymus Bosch's paintings. Yeah. Um, Yeah, no. So I think in this stage, I think what these early Bengal oil paintings that Shujan is pointing to now that we're looking at, or these Dutch Bengal paintings, are really interesting. Then to talk about this, confluence of cultures or different cultures coming together. Where do the lines blur? Why are the lines hardening today, or or not? So I think that's something that is we always enjoy this section of our gallery and these artworks to bring up those questions for students, for learners,
Mhm.
and to really unpack that. And like Shujan said, to unpack this idea of treating mythology as history and history as mythology. Where do the lines again get blurred, and what do students feel about that? So I think we always love bringing students to this gallery because of that. It's so interesting, like Shujan said, to see a scene from the Mahabharata set in a colonial mansion in Calcutta, or Radha wearing the kind of garment of a Mughal princess. So that's something which we love to really highlight. Just like with the previous section with the colonial artists, we like to talk about this idea of these contentions of um, you know justifications for colonization, what is remembered, what is forgotten, who is remembered and who is forgotten. So through these history paintings and landscape paintings of early colonial India. So yeah, and each of these artworks sort of lead us to very interesting questions. But of course, there are more such questions and possibilities that they also leave us open to. But yeah, back to the
Absolutely.
1850s and 1860s. Julia.
So yeah. So that's again what's also, I mean, the reason why, I mean, it's, I guess, one of the reasons why the museum exhibition is called Ghare Baire is precisely because of that um, there is virtually no point in this history of art, in this cultural history, that we can identify and say that this is not influenced by anything else. I mean, you could potentially argue that this very idea of cultural purity is, I mean, it's fictitious in a sense. I mean, there is virtually no, at literally no point can you just say that this is when, and that's the bit that we'll go on to the next, which is this the the late 19th century and the emergence of the Bengal school and its kind of interminglings with the Swadeshi movement, which starts off in around the 1905, 1906, and then goes on for the first few decades of the 20th century. Um, so while this kind of government art schools were training Indians in the arts, they were mostly training them as technical artists, out of which emerged several very important painters, some of whose works are there at Ghare Baire. They were mostly painting, like we saw, landscapes, portraits for, I mean, commissioned portraits, but also these mythological scenes, which served as quasi-religious, quasi-aesthetic objects. And what happens in around the late 19th century, and I mean, in terms of Bengal art, and this has important bearings on the direction it takes in the coming decades, is some European painters start to come to Bengal who are not looking to replicate this European mode of painting, who are thinking of alternatives, who are coming with a slightly more um, contemporary sense of what painting needs to be, moving away from this kind of academic realist mode, exploring different styles that are, I mean, perfectly prevalent in Europe. So, I mean, why is art in India stuck to this kind of neoclassical model? These ideas that are somewhat outdated, and um, among them, one of them, E.B. Havell, becomes an important influence in the life of Abanindranath Tagore, who was Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel laureate's nephew, and who kind of, becomes one of the founders of what later came to be known as the Bengal School of Art, and which kind of, I mean, makes this kind of significant break within Bengal. I mean, there are other modernist trajectories in different parts of India, but within Bengal, this is one of the important breaks that happens with this kind of colonial pedagogy in painting. And this is around the early 20th century. So Abanindranath, uh, as I mean, I think it happens with many of us. I mean, he just couldn't make sense of the kind of oil painting that was being taught in these schools and colleges, and he just couldn't paint with oil on canvas. And he really struggled with that. He gave up initially, but then he thought, that what if what they are teaching me doesn't make sense as a historical subject of India at this point in time? And that's such an important question to ask ourselves continuously, that, what if what we are learning is um, not something that I am able, I mean, it's not my fault, but it's what we are learning which is um, not working for me. And so he decided that he wanted to try and find an original kind of Indian form of art, to a new Indian form of art, and which wouldn't necessarily look back only to the past, but try to create this blend which would connect the past and the present and the future, and this kind of almost utopic envisioning that he has, where he thinks that, we don't want to look only to the West, which is not, but that's not an unproductive kind of shunning of European influence or Western influence, but a kind of way in which he imagines instead a pan-Asian kind of art, where he was free to draw from Japanese techniques, from Chinese techniques, means overlaps there as well. Um, Later painters of the Bengal school would also draw on Tibetan Buddhist symbols, um, going right up to West Asian cultures. And Abanindranath's first port of call, in a sense, was Mughal miniature, and he said that, this is what comes to mind when I think of Indian art. And but he still, in that Indian art that he envisioned, he found a lack of emotional depth. So he said that bhav is something that's lacking in this kind of Mughal miniature painting. And so he did this beautiful work, which was called The Passing of Shah Jahan. This is a print. Um, the original, I think, is either at the NGMA or at the Victoria Memorial. I'm not too sure. But this was basically where he used for the first time this wash technique, which they were kind of working on for a while, which was this kind of watercolor wash that brought this kind of emotional depth, emotional saturation. And, the sky itself and this kind of cloud capped moon becomes a reflection of what Shah Jahan feels as he looks back at the Taj Mahal, which he has built some years back for his wife, and he's at his deathbed with his daughter, and they're looking back. And quite remarkably, this won Abanindranath Prize at the Imperial Darbar that was hosted by Lord Curzon, and he was awarded a medal for being a miniaturist. And from there, we move to this work, which is fairly well known. This is his, I mean, what originally he tried to represent as the Bongo Mata, or the Mother Bengal, but with which at Sister Nivedita's insistence, he renamed as Bharat Mata, or Mother India. And Sister Nivedita was of the opinion that every Indian in the land ought to have a copy of this, and so on. And um, it also, I mean, going back to this question of cultural purity, this was at the peak of the Swadeshi movement. This work in particular was used for Swadeshi campaigns in on the streets where they were doing fundraising to support this kind of Swadeshi movement, which would shun colonial goods and culturally and economically try to bolster India's own wealth and services. And this was, for that um procession that went out in Calcutta, this was translated into this enormous banner by a Japanese artist. So this is a time when, imagine Swadeshi poster being painted by a Japanese painter. And this is a time when there are a number of Japanese artists who are coming to Bengal, largely spearheaded by the friendship between Rabindranath Tagore and Okakura, who was a cultural ambassador. And from these Japanese artists, painters in Bengal, like Abanindranath, like Nandalal Bose, they are kind of picking up these beautiful watercolor techniques where they would create this wash, which would give it the sense of, almost standing in the middle of infinity, sort of a thing, like this kind of eternal presence, this timelessness, this kind of mm, the kind of shading that they were doing, this kind of gradients that they were being able to produce. And Bharat Mata became this Swadeshi icon, which made Abanindranath somewhat uncomfortable, because the Tagores, although they were initially very invested in the Swadeshi, later kind of moved away from it because they felt uncomfortable with the unproductive aspects of it that they felt nationalist leaders were giving it. And we'll this is another fascinating work by Nandalal Bose, who was a student of Abanindranath Tagore, as well as the first principal of Shantiniketan's Kala Bhavan, which was the art school college at Rabindranath Tagore's University in Shantiniketan, which is in Bengal. And Nandalal Bose also, I'll leave you to it perhaps. I don't think we have too much time left in this session, but what really fascinates me and what we kind of try to work with, um, kind of try to read this painting, this work, is to see whether there is a kind of, by turning away from European traditions, if there is an uncomfortable glorification of this tradition of sati. Nandalal titles this Sati, and it's such a complex work. It's so difficult to kind of define it, saying that yeah, this is exactly what he means by this, or this is. No, we can't say. It's a contentious kind of work. So I hope we will share the link to this room after tomorrow's session, or maybe before tomorrow's session, so you can come back and take a look at these works up close in this kind of interactive mode, and let us know how you feel about these works. Um, yeah, so
So just again jumping in. So again, whenever we use this with students, these works from the early Bengal school period are really interesting to unpack many questions, like what is the idea of India? How was it shaped? What was included and what was left out? The fact that initially Bengal school artists really were drawn to Mughal miniatures and Mughal art as an intrinsic part of it, but later on there was a somewhat turning away from it in other scholars that who came in, or this uncomfortable relationship with existing, Hindu or upper caste traditions, the representation of women and the role of women in this, new notion of the nation. So I think each of these paintings open up so
yeah,
many such questions. And when we then think back to Abanindranath and this pan-Asian idea of art that we had, we can think about, how far that vision lasted and how much of it was changed or co-opted or reappropriated in different ways. So again, they don't leave us with answers, but open up many interesting questions for students, and to look at this very often taught and often repeated narrative of our nations or our region's history in some ways. But yeah.
yeah, no, thanks, Romana. That's absolutely. I think that is the fundamental point of which we are moving towards, which is to say how women are imagined in this idea of new nationalism that's emerging, and what are its legacies to this day. And of course, again, we come to this contentious point about, while you're looking away from the West and creating this kind of Pan-Asian identity, what are the uh, social blind spots, in a sense, that you're inscribing into this discourse itself? How much of an impact is it going to have? um, are women only to be seen as these kinds of ideal figures, as Uma, as Bharat Mata, or whoever we imagine her to be, where they are not so much, I mean, a non-speaking subject in a sense, they're just symbols. And that brings us, I mean, that's a nice way to kind of lead to the next artist that we look at, which is Shunayani Devi, who was, I mean, who was recognized in her own time, but um, she was labeled a naive artist, naive in the sense of, I mean, it's not necessarily a derogatory term, but it's a style of art that was supposed to have been mastered, which is sort of untouched by external influence. And Shunayani Devi was Abanindranath Tagore and Gaganendranath Tagore's sister, and she was this quite remarkable artist. There's not a great deal of information that is available about her, and whatever is available is probably available because she belonged to a family as eminent as the Tagores in Bengal. Um, Interestingly, what we also find is that, I mean, not so much, I don't think they're exact contemporaries, but the only other name among women artists at this time who really comes to mind is, of course, Amrita Shergill. And it's quite remarkable how different their trajectories are. Shunayani Devi is from this Tagore family, and she carves out a space for herself by her own right. And she herself would say that among, I mean, she would often find these images in her dreams. And that's how she would kind of come up with these images. um, she creates this kind of very interesting interiority within her women subjects. They hardly ever look directly at the viewer. They almost never acknowledge the viewer's gaze. They're always sort of side-eyeing one another. There's some sort of secret over there which you're not privy to. And she was also influenced by, and the reason why I think we wanted to kind of um, bring this up is that this is one of the few examples of an indigenous art form that we have in the collection, which is supposed to have, I mean, cast a fairly long shadow of influence upon artists from Bengal through the 1900s as well. And so Shunayani Devi again is one of those rare women artists of the time who is not never as, I mean, not nearly as celebrated as Abanindranath Tagore or Gaganendranath Tagore, probably because they could speak about what they were trying to do because it had connections, interconnections with other parts, other styles, and so on. And this is really, I mean, something which both. I'll just look for the messages, which both have a kind of, you know, I mean, it's interesting from the point of women's histories of art, because you also realize that so much of art before this was also done by women, but that was anonymous and therefore not recognized as women's art, such as, you know, things like embroidered kathas, embroidered quilts, other forms of painting that were done by women. But also, it's an important moment of this kind of Swadeshi introspection, where you're not looking outward but you're looking inward for influence. And I think representation of Bimla and Rabindranath's Ghare Baire is quite similar to the subject of these paintings. Absolutely. Um, does that turned gaze indicate voyeurism on the viewer's part, something that we are not privy to but may have stumbled upon? That's a very interesting way of putting it. I do think that, yeah, I mean, people are meant to feel a little, I mean, if not voyeuristic, at least, you know, I mean, yeah, I don't know if I would call it. I mean, of course, there is a certain amount of voyeurism, but it's not a kind of objectified voyeurism, I would say. It's more a kind of voyeurism into something that is deliberately kept enigmatic, or that's deliberately kept secretive. So it's voyeurism which is supposed to be frustrated. It's not a voyeurism that's supposed to satisfy. So in that sense, I think that is what would distinguish this from the kind of work a lot of male painters were doing at this time, such as Hemendranath Majumdar and others. So, but so for today, I think what we will do is we will stop at this for now, and the next session we will go move beyond this kind of Bengal school, because this um, the skin color of the male in the painting is blue. That's probably this one. If you're talking about Dimple,
No, the next one, the
the
Kalighat. Kali
Oh, the
Ghat one.
Kali Ghat one. Yeah. So this is supposed to be Ram, Lakshman, and Sita, and you can see a very shoddily drawn Hanuman uh, crouching under their throne for some reason. These were basically commercial art works that were, I mean, that were produced very quickly. This was urban art which were done by these Pottochitro artists who were basically originally scroll painters who painted with vegetable dyes on cloth, but they came to the city because Calcutta became an important center of pilgrimage, and they would kind of churn out these works for pilgrims who were coming to the Kali Ghat temple, which is why they are known as the Kali Ghat pots. So many of them were, in fact, they were apprentices. So a single painting could be worked upon by 3 or 4 artists who were doing different parts of the painting. So the Hanuman is probably, I mean, in my imagination, it's the customer hurrying them and saying that, fine, just give me, so long as you have completed Ram, Sita, and Lakshman, I can live with it, and rushing off with an incomplete kind of work. The milkmaid in front is fair, why are the others staring at her? That's probably, I mean, it's difficult to say. It's probably Radha and her gopis that we see in this work by Shunani Devi, which is probably why there's a kind of skin tone. You're absolutely right. These are things that are constantly there. We are just so used to it. We sometimes, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that's something we have also been talking about, like in terms of looking at skin tones of the various paintings. What is, I mean, there's also this whole point about, what kinds of pigments were available, how a certain skin tone would be represented, why is Krishna blue? These are all questions that, I mean, that keep coming up when you're delving into this kind of material aspects of art history as well. But yeah, absolutely. So this kind of brings us to the end of this kind of early 90s.
Shujan, we've lost. I think we've. Um, Hi.
Hi. Do we have time to take a few more questions, or Shujan
Yeah,
seems to
sure.
disappear here?
No, Shujan disappeared, but we can definitely take. I think his internet dropped off for a bit, but he'll come back. He has a backup connection. But yeah, we definitely have time to take questions. Just wrapping up what Shujan says that in this first room, as you can see in the virtual viewing room, there are 2 sections. So in this first room, we kind of land up. Oh, Shujan is back. Hi, Shujan. That we kind of land up in the early 1900s at the kind of start of the Swadeshi movement, or at the kind of peak of the Swadeshi movement, and then we carry on to look at how the late colonial period evolved, how it's reflected in the work of artists, and what happened after. So that is something we'll touch upon in tomorrow's session. But yeah, please, we'd love to take some questions. We'd also like to pose a question to the people watching and ask that, are there any artworks of the ones we've shown you today in the first room that you think might be relevant, or might pose interesting questions or points of contemplation and reflection in your classrooms or in your learning spaces or in your creative practice? So are there any particular artworks that, from the ones we've introduced you today, that you think might be interesting to apply back into the spaces that you are coming from or that you inhabit? But yeah, that's our question to you, but please feel free to also share questions for us. Siloni, thank you. The White Town depiction, absolutely. I think these images, which are also very freely available online because they've been extensively documented, are very interesting to use to defamiliarize this period of history, early colonization period that otherwise we are taught and sort of smothered with facts when we are in school or in college. Is the same link for tomorrow? Yes, no, Shujan? It's the same link for tomorrow. It's a recurring meeting. Yeah, and thank you, Saloni, for that. Yeah, while teaching the British Raj to students in the history lesson, absolutely.
May I ask a question, please?
Of course.
This is Arundhati Ray from Calcutta. It's nice to see the DAG people back again.
Nice to see
a lot
you
of your
too.
programs recently. Now, one thing which I found missing, was if you could, for tomorrow's chapter, maintain a thread of connection, of your paintings. Like today, it just appeared to be, to me, individual paintings, right? If there could be a more cohesive connected way of putting the pictures together. I think then for students, if they're watching this, from my perspective, I think it would be more meaningful to talk about a particular chapter of Indian history that you all are presenting through these 2 days. There must be, I felt there was a loss of connection, and they were more as treated as individual paintings of or works of art. If that could be maintained, I think it could come out more alive as a chapter of history.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you for that.
If it is possible.
I mean, we were kind of just threading them chronologically as the paintings evolved and as the kind of, history evolved as well along with that. But if that was not clear, then we can work to make it clearer for sure.
There was a
We have,
raised hand from Keshav.
Yeah, so if we could go back to the Kali Ghat painting representing Ram, Sita, Lakshman, and Hanuman. So what I found interesting in this painting was the skin tone color of Ram. Where I come from, particularly North India, Delhi, Ram is always depicted as fair colored person. So I find interesting here is some sort of alternative mythology here. Sort of like A.K. Ramanujan's essay 300 Ramayanas, we have an alternative version of Ram here that is not quite similar to the Ram I am used to.
probably sort of to emphasize his connection as the avatar of Krishna, maybe because that tradition is very strong in Bengal of Krishna, of the Vaishnav tradition. So it's perhaps to do with that. But even we also find it really interesting to show, which we don't have here, but images of Shiv and how he is also depicted in early Bengal paintings as this sort of pot-bellied, gentle, man. So that's again another that a depiction of Shiv is also interesting to talk about masculinity, and its interpretations over time. So yeah, all these differences are always interesting. Some theories say the alien sense colored blue.
Sorry, my video is not working, but that's may I say a little something about this painting as well? It's quite interesting what Keshav says, and I mean, we often encountered a similar problem working in Ladakh because there are many deities depicted over there, which are often shown in blue color or in green color. And we eventually realized that it was quite common for religious images which were meant to be shown as dark to be painted in a dark blue or a dark green color, because eventually those pigments would kind of age and start looking dark. So that was also one of, I mean, apart from, of course, the mythological and the iconographic representation of the avatars of Vishnu. I think these traditions kind of just, skip mediums. So for instance, when Keshav says that the Ram that is shown in North Indian temples ends up looking very fair and pink, that's probably because after a point, after 10th, 12th century, sculptures started appearing in marble. And when they were copied, in white marble, when they were copied into calendar art or when they were copied into visualizations in mass media, they tended to be white. But we all know if we went to a South Indian temple, it's likely that the Ram, the sculpture will be carved in a gray schist or maybe even black marble. And that's, I think it's just kind of from region to region, medium to medium, these things kind of just keep shifting.
That'll be a fascinating study thing to do, to collect these images from different regions as well and present that as a thought experiment, perhaps in classrooms. Yeah.
Okay, do we have any more questions or shall we wind up for the day?
I think we're good for now. We have some lovely comments. Thank you all for your comments as well. But yeah.
Thank you, Sujan. Thank you, Sumona. This has been absolutely fascinating. And I think all of us look forward to tomorrow. Abir, would you like to add something?
Can mute.
I'm still sort of taking in all the information that came in. Well, I just actually wanted to perhaps make a small comment for our audience from Ladakh, that let's not only confuse these sessions with some sort of these are not art history sessions as such. If you remember the manner in which Megha was introducing Shujan, for instance, it's actually to kind of raise our curiosity and raise our sort of pre-existing ideas or imaginations of what art is. And because this Kalighat pot is there on the screen as we speak, these are also lovely ways of interacting with regional styles. I mean, I would just wanted to add that the manner in which Ram and Lakshman and Sita are depicted here are perhaps the way that the nobility or the rich elite in Bengal would dress at the time. So it's not necessarily, and it also gives us an idea how contemporary cultures adapt narratives into their sort of existing forms. So definitely there's a lot to be said about the skin tone of Ram, and even my conjecture would be that it's from the lineage of painting the avatars who are always in this. Even Amar Chitrakatha, for instance, when we look at all the Amar Chitrakatha illustrated I don't know what to call them, comics, the avatars are always painted in a tone of blue. There's obviously a lot of reason why blue and all of that, but that may not be the right time to discuss it right now. But yes, I mean, this is a fantastic example of interacting with a particular style that evolved, like they were mentioning again, because of the commercial and the sort of urban cultures that were developing in Bengal at the time. And I would like to add that and as part of this series, just two things. One is, when we were speaking of the early paintings and lithographs and so on, that there is a large number of there's a lot of documentation of British cartographers and photographers and painters that happened in the Himalayas. And I would definitely like to perhaps include a couple of presentations on those in this series as we go along after the DAG Museum series is over, because it gives another view of the kind of both cartographic and documenting missions, that the British were conducting in the Himalayas. And second, like Jayati said, that this is also a lovely experience for us to look at how, while these may seem different frontiers of the empire, how there are common themes, how there are common ideas, how there are common aesthetics that are being propagated, and the manner that it builds on what is our visual culture of today. Yeah, but thank you so much. This was fascinating. I mean, there were so many things that I never thought of, and especially the black hole and the minar. Yeah, it was a very, very interesting presentation. So thank you so much for that. Yeah.
Thank you, and see you all tomorrow. Looking
Yep.
forward.
Thank you
Yep.
all.
So please, Megha, please announce that it's the same link that we shared
Yes.
today. So please join us tomorrow. We will share it amongst our groups again. But we had a packed house today, which is amazing. We had about 100 participants, and then I think a couple of people left. But we look forward to the same enthusiasm tomorrow as well. Yeah.
Yes, and the following weeks.
Yes.
Yep.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.